Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. And I am not a teacher. I am a game designer, game developer. I've been in the game industry for almost 20 years, almost as long as Games for Change has been around. But I started as a student at Carnegie Mellon's Entertainment Technology Center. And there I did work on a couple of Games for Change projects, but there wasn't really a lot of formal instruction on creating Games for Change. After I graduated, I went to work at Shell Games. I worked there for a long time, working on a lot of different projects, including a number of Games for Change, or what we called at that studio, transformational games. And it was there that from observing my teams and working with other teams and really interacting with other thought leaders in the space, that I developed the transformational framework, really for other developers to work on these kinds of projects. And that has now been used in a number of educational settings as well, which I take a lot of delight in because it was something that embodied what I wanted to send back into the past to myself, working on these kinds of projects. And so I'm very excited for this panel to talk about how are we preparing that next generation of developers? What are we passing on? How are we structuring these programs? And we have a wonderful group of panelists, 4 panelists, one here virtually, to talk about their programs, where they are. And I've asked them to each introduce themselves, not only who they are and their background, but also a little bit about their program, so you get a sense of that. Before we do the in-person panelists, we'll have Tran introduce herself virtually.
Hi, my name is Tran, and I'm a professor at DePaul University. I got my start making games for social change, partnering with organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations, and I have been working on creative advocacy and narrative change projects with Open Society Foundations for the past decade. I got my start making games for change when in graduate school at Parsons here in New York. My graduate thesis was a game for unaccompanied immigrant minors. From there, I started my first professorship at the University of Miami, where I co-directed Nerd Lab and focused on social justice and health-related projects. In 2021, I joined DePaul University in Chicago, where I am an assistant professor of games and design and direct Matters at Play. Matters at Play is a transdisciplinary design lab partnering in the creation of interactive advocacy solutions for positive social transformation, especially focused in social justice, environment, and health issues. And in the lab, we incubate and launch projects for real-world impact as part of a faculty-student collaborative, as well as in the classroom context and beyond. I have made games for a variety of topics across many different domains and contexts. And today I'll be sharing my experience teaching both at the University of Miami and DePaul in similar courses for Games for Change with slightly different structures and student profiles. In my course, I like to use existing frameworks, and I credit my fellow panelists and moderator Sabrina and Lindsay for their work on the transformational framework and the Doing Things with Games textbook, respectively. And in my own work, I use tandem transformational design when working with client partners, making sure that the research that they provide us and the goals that they have are in alignment with the iterative game design process. And one of such projects is Poor Not Guilty Challenges, and I invite you to visit and play at poornotguilty.org/challenge.
Great, thank you. And I'm Lindsay Grace. I'm a professor, game designer, developer, artist, and author. I've produced more than 75 peer-reviewed books, chapters, articles, and papers, primarily focused on Games for Change. Most notably is Doing Things with Games, Social Impact Through Play, which is what I primarily teach from. I also serve as the Higher Education Video Game Alliance Vice President, and I've served as the former Vice President of the Global Game Jam. And so a lot of the work I do is largely focused on iterative game design and rapid game making. I'm an awarded game designer, including getting the 2019 Vanguard Award winner for Games for Change, among others. And I produced more than 30 solo and team and student projects focused on Games for Change. I've also been teaching games for more than 15 years. And I've taught at these 3 institutions, Miami University, American University, and University of Miami, which are respectively public, private in DC, and private in Miami, Florida. That'll help inform some of the way that I've been sort of doing the work that I've been doing. Likewise, I've been director or co-director of the academic programs, which means I have control over curriculum, which is a distinct opportunity in this context. I've personally taught more than 90 class sections since 2003, more than 14 new classes created as part of my curriculum design at the institutions that I've worked, and I've created or co-created 4 degree programs specifically aimed at games or Games for Change. I've also done everything from classes in social impact game making, where we're just doing a simple one-semester implementation from marketing to release, as well as doing these sort of multi-semester, multi-instructor, multi-year projects combining teaching and game dev for impact. I've personally created 2 academic/instructional game studios that have gotten more than $1 million, or about $1 million in funding for students over the 6 years I ran both of them. My first was at Miami University, where I founded the A Game Studio, and that was really just seeded with $20,000 from Procter & Gamble, and generally operated with about 7 undergrad co-curricular students. So they weren't taking a class, they were working co-curricularly for internal and external clients. As well, at American University, the second studio I founded was with 5 faculty and 4 years of graduate students in a 2-year program. And the variety of clients include all of the logos you see up here, everything from Deloitte to ETS. And the framework that I typically use is a play-based design frame as articulated in doing things with games, which emphasizes game verbs. The whole idea is that readers read, audiences watch, and players do the story. And so it really just frames games as a collection of problems and solutions. And so mapping these game problems to real-world solutions is the goal, where we're trying to help people make playful, engaging game verbs. And so the idea is there's this hierarchy of general interactivity, which then becomes toys and then becomes full-fledged games. And so this analogy works across analog and digital games for everything from persuasive play and social impact to educational games, empathy games, and location-based community games as well.
Hey, it's me. Hi, everyone. So great to see you. So great to be here at Games for Change. I've been to almost every single Games for Change conference, and it's my favorite one. So I'm so, so happy to be here. I'm Dr. Kat Schrier. I've been teaching for 13 years. I am full-time right now at Marist College, where I am an associate professor and director of the Games and Emerging Media program, a program that I founded when I started there. And since being there, I've taught over, I think, 17 different courses that I've either taught or developed in some way. And I've taught like so many different kinds of classes, like everything from like game design to world building and storytelling to like reality TV classes. Like I really try to teach a lot of different classes. And prior to becoming a full-time professor, I worked at places like Nickelodeon, BrainPop, Scholastic. Currently, I'm working as a game designer, consulting with the World Health Organization, making games to help train healthcare professionals and make the world a safer, more healthy place, which is just so important in terms of social impact. I have also published a lot on games and learning. I love to write. I would love you to read my books. Some of them are free to download online, which is very useful. Learning Education and Games, if you Google it, you can find it and download. There's 3 out right now, but we're working on a 4th, which is going to be 50 games to use for inclusion, equity, and justice. In the middle, We the Gamers came out last year, and that's about teaching using games to teach ethics and civics, really important skills for an engaged world, an engaged public. And yeah, oh, also I really want to tell you about our new group called the Inclusive Games Network. You're all welcome to join. Go to inclusivegames.org to find out more, or you can email me about that. And just to give you like a really, really broad overview of the program that I founded at Marist College, everybody takes these courses. So we have classes in art, in business, in designing games, in programming. And then we have a 1-year capstone. Basically, we have a game studio class and a capping class that rounds out the entire series of classes. But we also have 2 different concentrations. One concentration is in design, writing, and culture that focuses in on the design and writing side of games. Or you can concentrate in the technical side, in the programming and development of games. But you still need to take a taste of the other side, right? So you have to take classes in the other, but also focus in on one of those sides. And I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Oh, there you
And finally, I'm Dave Solba. I'm the Director of Curriculum and an Associate Teaching Professor at Carnegie Mellon University at the Entertainment Technology Center. And so part of my job is to think about how we teach our courses and teach our students, in particular game design, but our program is really about the general collaborative creativity of developers and designers. And it turns out that transformational design, transformational games, is a really big part of what fits in with that, what our students do. A little bit of my background, I worked in industry for a little bit at EA. I spent a lot of time working on the OWLS project on how to sort of teach programming to students. And a little plug, I work on the XR Brain Jam at Games for Change for the past 5 years with Sabrina. And as that space of like, how do we bring people together and make experiences in a short period of time that are transformational. The context of where my teaching is so I teach at ETC, which is a master's program, and so it's very focused on professional skills, and we're very project-oriented, so a lot of the work we do in sort of design and development is with project teams, and getting a full semester to work, sort of like simulating professional work, and working with clients, working with partners, experts, and really digging into some of the transformational challenges. I also do work on sort of the undergrad, the elective side, with some game design stuff in our IDA program, and that's dealing with the challenges of like you only have a single semester with a student. They might not be in a longer track of courses, like I said, elective focus, possibly dealing with individuals or small teams that don't have technical expertise, so like working in analog spaces as well. Another part of my work, I've been working with the Transformational Framework for 7 years, which is longer than it's been published. Actually, a lot of the play testing of it was done at the ETC, so I got to work on some of the early revisions since I've been working with that framework for a long time, and it's informed a lot of the work I do as a teacher. All right.
So we're going to just discuss a few interesting questions from the panelists about the idea of teaching, and we're going to start with that idea of structure and how do you, in a semester, really capture some of the realities of production and also dealing with all these constraints of the skill level of the students, the fact that they're not just taking your class, all of those things. And we do have a video from Lien to start us off.
As a design professor, I often iterate on a course design and have also had the challenge of teaching Games for Change for a variety of different contexts. I find it helpful to share with all students, whether they are new to the design of games or primarily made games for entertainment, this mind map from Art of Game Design of what makes a game, the people involved, as well as the conceptual components. And also reminding students that the goal of Games for Change is some type of player transformation. And I also would like to emphasize that in my design classes, we were really looking at pre-production. And so we first start with the concept. And so for the concept, I like to then introduce students to the transformational framework. I have them read part of the book and listen to a video interview with Sabrina Solba. And then I provide them a template of the transformational framework worksheets that Sabrina created a few years back. I brought them into Google Slides so that students could work as a team to update these throughout their design research phase and to address all of the 8 areas listed here. And so they can take these templates and they're easy to update. And so this is one example of a game that I'll present, which is Battle of the Brands. And if you have really visually inclined students, they will even take this further and modify it to align with their project concept. So Battle of the Brands is a card game, which is a kind of scavenger hunt game for advertising students. And so based on a set of cards, students have to go find campaigns that have that type of representation. And the purpose of the game is to get advertising students to think more critically about the content of existing ads and to be more inclusive and diverse in their approach when coming up with new ideas in the future. After concept, we move into the beginning of pre-production, and I like to use Lindsay Grace's book, Doing Things with Games. And so I assign chapters from the text, including chapter 2, What is a Game?, where Lindsay identifies how the goal and obstruction of a game frame the problem, and the means should frame the solution. So I assign several games for change in which students analyze these different components of those games, and then we move into applying this into the design of their own games. One example of that from this past spring quarter at DePaul is Great Lakes Invasion. And so the goal of this project was to control invading populations that are invading the local area of the Great Lakes, specifically sea lampreys, and a primary obstruction to the livelihood of the local fish species is the spawning of new sea lampreys, which further endanger these endemic species. And so in the game, the mechanics are very much the means or framing the solution for this problem, which is that we should spend resources on actions to preserve local species populations, remove and also keep additional sea lampreys from spawning.
Okay, so Dave, I'll let you start us off. How does what Lien talked about compare to what happens at ETC?
Well, one of the things that I like about what Lien sort of showed is there's just a lot of structure and components to this. And so one of the things I really try to get straight first is a sense of what we're trying to do. So first off, like the idea of game development is a huge topic. And often there's a confusion, which is it game design or game development? So are we talking about making games? Are we talking about designing games? And when you bring in transformational, like transformational is an extra layer on top of all of that. And so knowing where you are in that is a really, really big deal. So like what Lien was showing is like the idea of pre-production, like being very conscious that we're tackling pre-production. Are we talking about pre-production that's going to flow into game development, or are we just going to do pre-production? And when you do transformational, knowing that there's specific things you need to address about that. So one of the things that, like working with like the framework, it breaks down things that are specific to transformational, like who is your audience, not just like who's playing it, but like who are the additional stakeholders. And so the idea of understanding the problem space and then using that to really focus the classroom experience. So some things I've done is like recognizing that pre-production can be hard, like being creative and thinking. So shortcutting possibly creative moments where you assign prompts as opposed to give students a blank slate is a very intentional move to say, okay, we're not going to do this sort of like early pre-production ideation thing. We're going to jump to this point in the process. And so if you sort of can break down the whole space, then you can kind of target in the classroom where you want to be focused. And you need to be aware of things. Are the students new to this? So if they're new, then you can't just start throwing around game design terms and expect them to know it and use it. And in fact, one of the common frustrations when working with students is if you're coming from an experienced industry space, you just start talking about, oh, you do this. And a thing I've particularly found is the sort of the gap between inexperience and experience is someone who's experienced can jump to answers, to solutions really quickly. And so you need to be ready with students on how to know where they are and get them to the next steps, understanding that they don't have the experience to just, in their mind, reject all the things that won't work and then jump to the right things. And so being patient and being ready to like scaffold that is a really big part of the space you want to create in the classroom. And I see things like being very intentional about assignment design, where you don't just give them open-ended prompts. You think about how do we get to this point and give structure. In the classroom, I really like hands-on workshop-like things. So instead of just talking about it, you give them a small example and have them discuss and work on it. That then leads into work. So things like that where you break it down, understand where they are, and sort of give them a chance to work on it is how I really like to think about bridging the beginner educational space and getting to the professional skills that we're talking about.
And most of the ETC projects then transition into actually producing some kind of prototype working thing by the end of the semester.
We have the time and space where they can really approach the whole pipeline, but we have the luxury of students in teams of 4 to 6 who are working approximately 40 hours a week on that very specific thing, which is a huge luxury of time.
Right. And I'm seeing a lot of head nodding over here. So Lindsay, can you comment on how that compares for your program?
Sure. I think one of the things that is really important is exactly like you said, the sort of idea of giving them some frame and giving them some constraints. And so one of the ways that I've often handled this is that it takes so much time to work with sort of real world clients that we actually bring the client in and give them pitch sheets first. And so the students are already working from a pitch sheet. They're not doing the ideation process, but there's so much more that has to do with pre-production. So like in my book, I talk about identifying demographics, psychographics, and technographics, because students often don't think in those terms. They go, this is the iPhone that I have. And then when we start worrying about some of the very logistical realities of producing a Games for Change in this context, it helps them get a taste for why it takes 2 years to produce a game, not 2 weeks.
Right. Well, let's keep going on that conversation about collaborations. You mentioned working with clients. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So one of the things I've done in the studios that I run as sort of co-curricular or integrated into curriculum is I tend to try and spend a lot of my time engaging with external clients. And often these might be federal entities with 3-letter acronyms, or they may be private entities that are sort of saying, I think we need a game, I think that's the solution. And so there's sort of a couple of models I've used. One is what I just mentioned, which is to actually do some of the ideation for the student groups up front so that we can actually get the stakeholder on board on some specific version of a project, so that we're not still trying to figure out 6 weeks into a semester whether or not it's a role-playing game, a card game, a board game, or something entirely different. This also helps us scope. And so I like that because the reality is of an academic semester, you just don't have all the time you hope. And I usually warn students up front that every project falls short on something, so it's typically time or budget. You wish if you had another couple of weeks, you could do a whole lot more. And so by giving those constraints up front, I actually think it supports their student success. But at the same time, one of the trade-offs there is that the students may not be as invested in the idea because it's not theirs. But I think any educator has seen this happen in every classroom, which is that someone is over-invested in the idea because it's theirs, and they fail to recognize that the demographic they intended is not engaged or interested in it. They tend to be less critical, and so it's often a push-pull in the classes that I do. And I've also had the benefit of as others have mentioned, of being able to develop curriculum around this, so we can actually sort of mandate that this semester, this is the client, and this is what we're doing. And we tend to focus a lot on full production. So there's the ability, if you have the right curriculum, to run over 2 semesters so that you can make sure that the project actually completes.
And that point about it not being your concept, of course, when you go out into industry, a lot of times you're working for a client. You may not have been on the initial pre-production team, and so that's a real-world skill. Kat, can you speak a little bit about that, working with clients in your classes?
Yeah, so I kind of just throw my students right in. There's no money, there's no money exchange, but we do use outside clients, mostly not-for-profits. One of the things that I love about our program is really the focus on social impact, working with community organizations. I teach a class that's on design thinking, and in that class, it's completely an introduction for everybody. There's some game design students, but there's also students that are business majors, that are journalism majors, that are PR majors. This is the first time they're even thinking about design, even thinking about what it means to solve problems with design. And so I love what you said about structure, about process. I always use the same process every single semester. And sometimes the students don't really understand where they're headed until they're at the end. And then they almost have to go through the whole cycle again to really fully understand this. So what I do is I do a mini cycle at first. I have them go through a fake just a fake, here, let's go spend a day just going through a fake, the whole process. I give them a prompt, and then they go through the whole process just to see what it will be like for the whole semester. And we work with all different kinds of clients, local organizations like the Chamber of Commerce or Salvation Army. For one of the projects, students worked with this therapeutic horse farm called Lucky Orphans, which was so wonderful. The students made a playful app that helps you to get to know each of the horses that were at the farm. And the client loved it so much that they ended up implementing it. So one thing is that we focus just on design, not on implementation. If the client wants to implement, we give them presentation, design document, prototype, all of that. They can then implement it if they want. One of the issues sometimes is that clients don't always understand that we're not fully executing on the project. So I have to really communicate with that client. Again, no money is exchanged. So this is really about mentorship and giving feedback to the students. They get to get that real world experience with a client, but they don't have the real world budget experience like you were talking about. If you could just click to the next slide.
Lien had a couple of comments too, so I'll let her.
Oh, okay. So I was just going to say that one of the challenges sometimes is that we, I've worked with some global organizations like EDL, Global Game Jam. We had a game jam at Marist College, which was focused on identity. And one of the challenges was that, sometimes students don't want to make games about social impact. And we actually did a study, and we found that 14% of the students were almost like resistant to it. And so I would say like that would be like one of the biggest challenges, is that yes, most of your students might be really excited about doing games for social impact, but there's always that small group of people that maybe aren't, and it might kind of affect what you're trying to accomplish. And so the question is like, how do we reach those people that are most resistant to making these kinds of games, to really doing things that have a social impact?
And I want to circle back to that when we talk
Yes,
about a little bit
course.
more about some of
Absolutely.
the ethics involved in
Yes.
teaching these courses and working on these kinds of games. I'm going to let Lien speak a little bit about clients.
One of the benefits of partnering with subject matter experts or organizations in the classroom is that these will give students hands-on experience working with clients. Clients will give honest and critical feedback, and they will also give very challenging constraints for students to consider, because they must have the project align with the needs and goals of the organization. So we were fortunate enough in spring 2021 at DePaul to have World Wildlife Fund as our client partner for the Games with a Purpose course. This is a 10-week quarter course, and I had students from across many different programs. And so they formed teams in phase 1 to do design research and to pitch concepts, 4 of which were selected and were advanced into phase 2 for iterative design. Interestingly, this course was fully online due to effects of the pandemic. So it was actually really easy to meet with our client partner remotely, as they were all based in Washington, D.C. And interestingly, also all of the concepts that were proposed were digital concepts, which is unique compared to other times when I've taught this course. Another great reason to work with client partners is that they will provide a design brief and provide lots of accessible research. And with World Wildlife Fund, they gave a lot of really accessible information to our students because they are already trying to reach a wide range of audiences, including their member base and beyond. They also have a lot of great partners that they were able to point us to. And so with the design brief and scope of reducing plastics in nature, we have a lot to work on and work with. And World Wildlife Fund also helped to have us move beyond the idea of just recycling as a solution, that also we need to transition from a linear to circular economy in order to prevent plastic production, which is one of the proof of concepts that we came up with. And another one was addressing ghost gear. So ghost gear is a kind of fishing gear that has been abandoned in the ocean, and they're really harmful to marine wildlife because when they are abandoned, they are left, and many species will get caught in them and die. So this was the area of concern for the Coast Ghost team, which developed a Unity prototype in about 4 weeks. And so the goal of the experience was to save marine life from the harms of ghost gear through the actual game, and also to raise awareness and promote other solutions that are listed on sites like the Ghost Gear Initiative's website. The key obstruction in this system is that ghost gear traps fish and other animals that will ultimately die unable to escape. And so the means and the mechanics in this game are also part of the solution for the system. And in this game, you are the diver pictured in the image, and you have 3 main things that you can do. You can free trapped animals, you can scoop up loose gear, and you can grab large, heavy clumps of gear.
So I want just to connect to what she was saying and what you were saying, that some of the benefits of working with clients is that brief that you get and the focusing, Lindsay, you mentioned of what it is that you're going to be working on. But you also mentioned that sometimes people don't want to work on that. And that is, you are adopting a kind of a worldview and promoting that worldview when you're making a transformational game. So can you talk a little more about the ethical considerations, the discussions you might have in the classroom about the ethics of teaching these kinds of games?
Yeah, wow. I mean, there are so many ethical considerations. I teach a class on ethics in gaming. I also write about this in my book, We the Gamers. But there's so many. I'm just going to talk about 3 right now. So the first one I talk about in my classroom is really focusing on ethics of representation. Who gets to make the game? What kinds of voices and stories are included when you're making a game? These are the things that we have to really think about, like how are we representing cultures, but also how are we representing information or topics? How accurate is that? And also, how do you balance accuracy with gameplay? right? So you always have to be thinking about the ethics of representing all of that, right? Whether it's culture, whether it's information, whether it's topics, whether it's themes. The second thing that I talk about is also related to the ethics of care. I talk a lot about the ethics of care framework and our obligation. Like, what is our obligation when we're caring for another? And when I think about that, I think about, like, if we're designing games, we also have an obligation to our players, right? We need to care for our players, and how do we ensure that we're not re-traumatizing them, right? So for example, I'm making a game for Nigerian youth, and I'm working with the Lagos Business School, and we're designing a game to enhance empathy and compassion for different ethnic groups in Nigeria. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is that you're basically playing as someone else. So you're playing, if you're, for example, Igbo, you might play as someone who's Hausa. And you might then face the biases and discrimination that someone who's Hausa in Nigeria might face. And so we don't want to re-traumatize someone. We don't want to traumatize someone by facing that discrimination in a VR game. So we have to always think about the ethics of that. Like, how are we managing that? Like, are people so overwhelmed that they can't play something? Like, for example, that Dragon Cancer, we play that game and it's a wonderful, absolutely wonderful game. But some students are going through having a parent or a sibling who is dealing with cancer, and it's like too overwhelming for them to play that game. And so it's like, how do we manage the ethics of caring for our player? And then the third thing that I talk about a lot is also like reflecting on our own biases. Like, how do we as people design, and what are our own biases, and how are we transparent about those biases? Like, every game, every person is biased, right? We're products of our time, of our place, of our situation. We can't help but have these biases that are then reflected in the games that we design. But what do we do about that? How do we reflect on that? How do we show that? How do we lift the hood of our game and show the kinds of decisions that we made when we're designing our games? And so those are like the three main areas, but of course, we're always talking about the issues of the day. Like, every week, we have a different ethical issue that comes up in the news, and we talk about that, and we reflect on that. And that kind of dialogue, that kind of negotiation is so important, because there's always going to be new questions. And so the point is to, like, help our students become ethical thinkers so they could approach any question that comes up.
And that's great that in the classroom, sometimes when you're in the development cycle in a studio, you may not yet have built in an opportunity to speak to those ethical questions on a project or working with a client. So I think that's an interesting contrast in the classroom. What about at the ETC? Is that the questions of ethics, how does it intersect?
Well, I particularly like how this point raises the idea that like games change, transformational games are a really strong way to start to ask these questions, because a lot of times when you're working with students with just entertainment games, like, entertainment is kind of an excuse. It's a way to sort of see, that it doesn't matter as much. Oh, we can make a joke, we can sort of play off of that. But when you're engaging with something that's trying to really be transformational, one, you have to acknowledge the fact that you're making an experience that's trying to change another person. And like, that is a really profound moment for a new designer, to sort of like recognize that they're not just making something. They're making something for an audience, and they're actually trying to change their audience. And now you kind of have to ask the question, like, what are you going to do with that power? And that's like a little like foot in the door to all these big conversations. And like, these are important conversations. And I think, when you look to like teaching transformational games, like, it isn't just this little space of game design. It's the bigger space. And I think the ethics of all this is a huge part that is a big thing. And so like, we've seen this, like, we have students who like are working with clients, and like, we have a very international population. And so like, I have to like work now on like how my perspective isn't their perspective, isn't the client's perspective, and how do we sort of like fit this all together. I remember a team actually making an experience for Games for Change, international group of students. Their topic was gun control. And their exploration into gun control in the United States their reaction was, this is insane. And it was like going into that project, it had not occurred to me that it was something you'd have to discover and like start to appreciate. But the students actually learning about that and building an experience to change people who were going to be coming to New York, but they themselves were from different countries. There was an interesting just conversations happening, and there was learning that was going on that wasn't just, okay, so how do we like start pre-production, things like that. And it's been really fascinating to see like how it all weaves together. And I think it shows that transformational design is a particularly powerful way to focus a lot of these questions.
If I may, I think one of the things that I think is really important is that when we're teaching people game design, we're actually teaching them about addressing problems, and so framing the problems are often an ethical consideration, right? The way that you say this problem of climate change is addressed is potentially an ethical claim, and I think that's what's really wonderful about even the people who don't go into Games for Change. Essentially what we're doing is we're teaching them to be good critical thinkers and to apply that to the rest of their media consumption, to say, this movie says all I have to do is this game says all I have to do is this. Yeah, absolutely love it.
No, I was just gonna move us to, I think this is a great transition to like, what are the benefits?
Sure, so I mean, I argue for this all the time. I generally describe, and I think I did a GDC talk years ago about it, but I argue that game design fundamentally is a 21st century liberal art. It's about combining psychology, technology, anthropology, all these other disciplines and trying to solve a very specific problem. And what I think is really invigorating about it is there are perpetually new problems. As soon as I produce one game that says the way to address poverty in the US is this, I have an opportunity to produce another because it's another perspective on the same problem. And so I think generally when we're talking about this sort of like the benefits of learning the practice of creating games for change, it's about understanding the intersection of a sort of a transformational goal or goal in media generally, and trying to help people move just a little bit in that direction, and recognizing as you design your own game that there are so many considerations, and that this even a small move is actually a really powerful thing. I think particularly for younger generations, there's a lack of media critical perspective, and there's a sort of assumption that that there are no other biases embedded in these things. And I think it's really important to get people to think about producing media like games in this context, so they realize procedural rhetoric and the other ways that we actually try and help people understand the world around them.
Yeah, I mean, these games are a lens. Like using the game design process even is a great lens to sort of understand these critical issues and how to think about them.
Yeah.
Kat, can you speak a little bit more to this as well?
Yeah, wow, everybody has said so many amazing things, and I just wanted to like share a story of what happened in one of my games classes. I had my students play a game. It was a really small game, short game called The End of Us. It was made as part of the 2011 Global Game Jam, made possibly by some students, right? It was really like a 5-minute game. Basically, you're playing as a comet, and then there's this other comet. Do you know this game? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's lovely. And so you're kind of playfully interacting with the comet, and you're having these wonderful interactions. And it's really simple. You're just kind of moving around, and you're seeing the other one move around, and it's like, wow, okay. Spoiler alert, at that point, you have to make a choice. Either you die as a comet and you kind of burn out, or the other comet, and then one of them is left alone for the end of time, and that's it. One of them is left alone. And when my students played this, we were having a discussion about it, and when one of my students, a male student, was just crying as he was recounting playing this game, like, oh, I had to make this choice. It was so difficult. I was so moved by this. And then all of my other students started chiming in too. Oh, it was so hard, and that everybody's just in tears, and we're all sharing. And then they're starting to talk about other games that made them cry, like The Last of Us and Red Dead Redemption 2 and Shadow of the Colossus, and they're starting to bring all of these experiences of when they were moved by a game. And after we had this discussion, they all became so much more vulnerable and open, and then their games were more vulnerable and open. And then we were all just a collective of people who could feel and share and care and connect with each other. And I feel like that's the power of teaching these kinds of games for change, these games for social impact, is that it could change one person and change one class, and then change the way that you think about what games can do.
And fundamentally, and you mentioned this earlier, this sense of general entertainment. If you are designing a game experience and you don't want to solicit change, then you're not designing an interesting game. Even if it's joy, it's change, right? So this case study we talk about is actually what we're all trying to do when we do game design.
Yeah, and I'm sort of the opinion now that if you're going to get into being a designer, you really need to acknowledge that. And being I believe that actually transformational game design is the best entry point because it forces you to confront so many of these things that are essential to the discipline. It's designing for an audience that's not you. Yeah. It's designing for specific goals. My goal is to create joy, to create sadness, to create behavior change. They're all just similar forms of change. Yep. And acknowledging that it's not just, oh, I've played a game like this, I want to make a game like that. That is a very superficial approach. And when you make a game that is explicitly about change, you really confront that. And you confront that your audience isn't you, and the way they interact with it isn't the way you interact with it. You confront that my desire to make change, I have to own it. I have to actually think about what it means to take someone who isn't changed, have them do something and have that change happen, and have that change be something that I'm trying to make happen. And that process, that is how game designers, that's the games that are great, that is how they're made. They might be a game that's millions of dollars in budget and AAA, but that's game design. Right.
Yeah. And you could also argue that's great art, and that's great media, right? Yeah. Great books change you. If they didn't, then why'd you read it?
Yeah. How many of your students from your programs are coming in, they're not necessarily going into games, because there's a flip side of it too. There's the people who are looking to make change and seeing the games medium as a potentially new way to think about how to change people.
In our program, for example, you have a lot of students who are interested in UX, UI. They're interested in more sort of commercial enterprises. And the easy example I give them is that they're still engaging with media and they're changing. So the first studio I founded was Procter & Gamble, interested in advert games. And I was like, actually, that's kind of games for change. It's just games for change for profit. And I actually think that that's usually the easiest entree for students, is to recognize that this is still a medium that solicits some version of change, whether or not you're working for L'Oreal or the World Wildlife Foundation.
Yeah, I think a lot of my students come in wanting to work in commercial games, AAA, but they never had any experience with games for change or indie games. And not a surprise, I sometimes see some of my students here. I see them volunteering now. I see them excited about this new field because they've now had an experience working on not only games, but like you were saying, apps, websites, other kinds of media for social impact. And I think it does change them. I mean, that's our goal, right? As teachers, we want to transform our students, right? And to expand and inspire growth. And I think that we can do that through this kind of medium, but there's a lot of ways to do it.
And I believe if I had students who went through and learned to make games for change, make transformations, and they went to work for a big company making apps, I kind of want that student making those apps. I want them to be aware of the audience and their power and the leverage they have and how they have to be careful. Because it's that the designers who aren't thinking about that, that's where I'm worried, but the designers who are thinking about, okay, we are making things that change people, that's the root of this, and that's where it's really important.
I think with that, we'll wrap up. I agree. It's such an important aspect of teaching games, is thinking about the impact of the games. And when you come in through transformational games, that's at the forefront of what you're discussing. So I hope everyone enjoyed the panel. The contact information for all our panelists is up on the screen. Please reach out. I think everybody here would be interested in connecting with other potential clients to work with classrooms or to talk about their programs. And that's it from us. Thank you. Have a great rest of your time at Games for Change.
Thank you.